You're watching
West Hartford
Community Television.
For the community.
for the community,
By the community.
by the community.
and it's a wrap.
By reading a Dalet as a Resh or a Resh as a Dalet, then what you know is that the person who produced that translation was not translating it from the Greek, right? You know that that person was translating it from the Hebrew because that's the only way that that mistake could have been introduced.
Hello and welcome to Shalom Hartford. Today I'm speaking to Jeffrey Shoulson. He's a Fulbright scholar, an expert in 17th century English literature, and he was the Director of Judaic Studies at University of Miami and UConn. Today he is one of the Vice Provost of UConn. How does that happen? I'm Pat Kazakoff. You're watching Shalom Hartford. Stay with me and we're going to meet Jeffrey Shoulson. So you heard my introduction.
I did.
So my first question is, why is a Jewish boy interested in 17th century literature? How does that happen?
It didn't happen overnight. It's something that kind of became a gradual interest of mine. When I was in high school, I didn't think I was as particularly interested in literature. When I got to college, I started to take some college classes in English literature. And as I started to read more and more, and especially as I started to encounter the work of John Milton, the great English epic poet of the 17th century, I became interested in it, especially because it seemed to me that it had elements that I recognized from my own traditional Jewish upbringing.
Were you from an Orthodox home?
I was. I grew up in a modern Orthodox home in northern New Jersey.
Where in New Jersey?
West Orange, New Jersey. I
Right.
was born in Belleville, New Jersey. We moved to West Caldwell, New Jersey when I was 2 or 3, and then we moved to West Orange when I was about 10, all in Essex County, and spent the rest of my childhood and teenage years living in northern New Jersey. And went to Jewish day schools all of my education, from kindergarten all the way through high school.
So you had a classical Jewish education,
I did, yeah.
like a Solomon Schechter type of?
No, more modern Orthodox.
Modern
Schechter is more of a conservative, from the conservative movement. I went to a small, very small Jewish Orthodox day school in northern New Jersey, in South Orange until the 5th grade, and then in the 6th grade I started going to a school in New York City called Ramaz, which many people have heard of, a Jewish day school in Ramaz that I continued to stay in until the end of high school. I graduated from Ramaz.
So I'm noticing that you're not wearing a yarmulke.
Right.
And so that there's some disconnect there. If you had like this very modern Orthodox upbringing, what happened in the meantime?
Well, it's a longish story. I won't bore you with all of the details, but I think over the course of the years that I was in college, I started to have some questions and doubts, took issue with some of the things that I had taken for granted as I was growing up. Went through a period that I think is not all that uncommon for teenagers and kids in their early 20s of really having some very serious doubts about my own traditional upbringing. And for a while was, I would say, even a bit hostile to that upbringing.
Hostile is a gentle word, probably,
Yeah.
because there's a big rebellion.
There was some rejection. I will put it in those terms. I rejected some of what I had taken for granted for so many years. I actually decided to take my kippah off, which I wore on a regular basis, the day that I started college. And at that point, I was still assuming or imagining that I was going to live my life as a traditional Orthodox Jew with all of the various observances associated with that.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Princeton. On the drive down to Princeton with my parents, I was thinking about it. I had my kippah on, and I decided about 5 minutes before we pulled up to the parking lot that I was going to take it off. It was a bit of a gut response, a gut reaction, especially since I had spent the year before that, not in high school, but studying in the yeshiva in Israel. So I had dedicated even a year beyond high school to intensive Jewish studies. But I think I imagined that the kippah would be a bit of a marker of who I was that I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to present as when I first got there. I wanted to make my way in a way that didn't come with too many assumptions about who I was.
And you were at Princeton.
And I was at Princeton. It wasn't that it was an inhospitable place to wear a kippah, and I had friends who kept their kippot on as long as they were there, and I don't think that they would say that they ever encountered any overt hostility or resistance to their decision, but it was something that I decided to do. I know my parents were probably a bit disappointed, but I had some precedent only because my dad, who remains a traditionally Orthodox observer, when he was not in the house, when he was out in the workplace, he's a lawyer, did not wear a kippah. So it didn't seem like it was that big of a stretch for me at the time to choose to remove my yarmulke, though that was really all I had decided at that point.
So then where did the Milton come into this? Because it's not, I mean, it's a little esoteric. Milton's a little esoteric, and it's far removed.
Right.
Jewish boys don't study Milton.
Right. So I have to say the first time I read Milton was when I was in high school, and it didn't make a whole lot of an impression on me. It's very difficult. It's very dense material. It seemed a little bit beyond my capacity to really fully appreciate.
Well, you must have been a good student. You went to
I was a
Princeton.
good student, but literature was not really the course, or English was never the subject that I felt was my subject. I
What
thought
was
I
your
was
subject?
strong in math. I thought I was a strong history student. I had been captain of my debate team, and I thought I was good at that sort of thing. I just imagined I was going to go to college and become a lawyer like my father. That was sort of the path I had in my mind when I started college.
That was your vision.
Yeah,
That was your vision.
mean, nothing more specific than that.
Did anything characterize you you said you were president of the debate team.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have other leadership positions in college?
In college, yes. In college, I got involved in journalism and ultimately became the publisher of the weekly newspaper on campus. I was also a resident advisor, so in my junior and senior year, I lived with freshmen and had some responsibilities as a kind of counselor, freshman counselor and freshman advisor for them. I was pretty active in the Jewish community on campus, took on some various leadership roles there, though as my own journey progressed religiously and in terms of my own sense of my Jewishness, I stepped away from taking on some of the more assumed roles that I would take on at Princeton, having come from the kind of traditional background that I came from.
And what would have been an assumed role in?
So there was a relatively small population of observant kids on campus, and we depended on each other to make sure that there was a regular daily minyan, that the services were populated sufficiently, that there were people reading the Torah every Shabbat morning, that people would be participating in all of the
So you were
various
part
kinds
of that
Jewish communal
community.
activity. Yeah, I ate at the kosher kitchen pretty regularly, though not all the time. I remained friends with many of the people who remained very, very committed to that world, though I separated myself a bit from them.
Were you conscious at the time that you were doing this?
Yes, I was, absolutely.
So it was quite planful.
Well, I wouldn't call it planful. I would call it conscious. I mean, I think it was incremental. Along the way, I would reach a new point where I would have to decide, well, am I going to go to services on Friday night, or am I going to go to this party on Friday night?
And sometimes you made...
Sometimes I made one decision, and sometimes I made another
So then
decision.
how do we get back into Milton? How did Milton come into this
So
story?
I'm taking my freshman English class at Princeton, and we're reading Paradise Lost, and especially I think having come from the year in Israel in the yeshiva, I was struck by just how much what Milton was doing with biblical literature seemed to me to be a lot like what rabbinic tradition had done with biblical literature. That is to say, filling in gaps, expanding narratives, developing ideas about the biblical text that were only suggested or hinted at in the notoriously elliptical material that is in the Bible.
So you saw parallels.
I did.
And you must have seen parallels that nobody else saw.
Well, at the time, I thought I was the only one who saw them. I learned pretty quickly that I wasn't the first to have seen this. And then one of the requirements at Princeton is to do a substantial amount of independent work as part of your major. So in my junior year, I did 2 independent papers, junior papers, and then in my senior year, I did a senior thesis. And in the second of my junior papers, and then in my senior thesis, I wrote about this interest in the relationship between Milton and rabbinic literature.
And you also got a PhD.
And then I went on to do my graduate work.
Right, you got the PhD
Yale.
at Yale.
Right.
And you got a Fulbright, and you were a Fulbright scholar.
Right. I did a year after Princeton at Cambridge in England on a Fulbright, and I got an MPhil in Renaissance Studies there.
What does that mean, MPhil?
Well, it's sort of the equivalent of an MA or a master's. At Cambridge and Oxford, the MA is a kind of honorific degree. It's essentially a money-making scheme where a student who has graduated and gotten his BA 10 years later can pay a certain fee and then get the MA after his name. So the MPhil is actually an academic degree, and it's differently configured for different subjects. This was a relatively new degree in Renaissance literature that I sort of fell into when I was there.
So there can't be a lot of Jews doing that.
Not at Cambridge the year that I was there, no.
Right.
Though I was fortunate enough to work with an extraordinary scholar at the time. She's since passed away, but a woman named Lisa Jardine, who was my director, my advisor at Cambridge. And she was from a Jewish background, and there was a certain kind of sympathy, I think, that we felt for one another.
Simpatico.
She recognized what my interest in the material was. I think this may be overstating the case, but I think there was a certain kind of anthropological interest that I had in the material. Because as someone who did not grow up in the Christian tradition, who looked at it from the outside, I was fascinated by a period of literature in which Christianity was still very, very essential to its character, to its nature. And to think about that, that as an outsider, as not someone who was in the tradition, but who could look at it with a degree of, I won't call it objectivity, but a degree of distance that, say, someone who was raised within the Christian tradition might not have had. I thought that gave me a certain kind of perspective that not many scholars in the field had, though I learned subsequently that there were others before me who had a similar kind of notion about that.
So I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing a lot of passion in your voice as you're talking about Milton and the parallels in the rabbinic literature. I can feel that. And so your first job was as a scholar, as a professor?
Yes.
Of
so
Milton.
I finished graduate school in 1995. And got a position in that year at the University of Miami. The position was in 17th century literature.
And that's what you were teaching.
Right, exactly.
So how do we get from 17th century literature to being the director of Judaic Studies at University of Miami? It's a big jump.
It is.
And you don't have a degree in rabbinic studies.
Correct.
You have a background.
I have a background in it, and most of my scholarship involved looking at English literature with the added component of Judaic studies. That was something that I had written my dissertation using, and that I was now revising that dissertation into my first book using. Some of it was just happenstance. The same year that I was hired, the University of Miami English Department also hired someone in Jewish literature. And so all of a sudden the department had at least two, if not more, faculty members who had a certain kind of interest in and focus on Jewish literature in very different periods. My colleague Michael was working on the modern period in the 20th century, and I was interested in the early modern period. So there was this kind of happy coincidence of us both arriving on campus at the same time and contributing to a fledgling Jewish studies program that really was
And he was a
understaffed.
Professor also, Michael.
Correct. Michael Rothberg.
Michael Rothberg.
Who's now at the University of California, Los Angeles at UCLA. He's a very, very accomplished scholar of Holocaust literature. We both found ourselves getting increasingly involved in the Jewish Studies program that was trying to get increased interest in its courses and in trying to get students to come involve itself in the programs. And so I became involved in that program. There was an advisory committee of faculty that I started to become a participant of. And at a certain point, right around the same time that I was being reviewed for my tenure and promotion to associate professor, the program needed a new director. And there was an initial effort to try to bring in someone from the outside, which failed for a variety of reasons. And so the dean came to me and said, "Would you be interested in this directorship?"
How old were you?
Well, this would have been in around year 2000 or so, 2001. So I was about what that would have made me. That would have made me 36.
I said 38, but 36.
Excuse me, yes, 36. I was born in 1965.
So
I
were
was
you
36.
surprised? Were you?
Not especially. There weren't a whole lot of obvious other alternatives to take on this job, because at that point Michael had left for a different position, and we had hired someone to replace him, but he was pretty junior and wasn't really ready to step in and take on that role.
So you felt good? You felt right?
I did. It seemed like a good opportunity for me to get a little bit of experience administering a pretty modest program, one that didn't have a whole lot of demands on it, but that had a lot of room for growth. We were in an advantageous position because it was affiliated with a center that had just been established and was under the directorship of a senior scholar who had managed to raise a significant amount of money, some of which I knew would be available to me for my programming desires and needs. So it looked like a good chance to try something out, to see if I could do something beyond just my own scholarship and beyond my own teaching, that I could have an impact beyond that on the larger institution.
So you
to
felt
build the
good
program.
about this?
I did, yeah.
And you felt that you were in the right place?
Yes, I mean, it was a great opportunity. I mean, the University of Miami gave me a lot of really wonderful opportunities to grow professionally. I did that I was the director of that program for 4 or 5 years, and then I went on sabbatical. I had actually delayed my sabbatical in order to do that, but I wanted to get a new book written.
Let me ask you. Most people who are directors of programs in a university setting, do they usually have that as their scholarship?
No. I was trying to maintain my own scholarship even as I was doing this administrative work and teaching the courses that I was teaching. I did get a 1 course load reduction in order to be able to devote some more time to the directorship of the program. But no, the scholarship is outside of any of that. I mean, it's true that some people who get involved in administering these programs start to become so interested in the work that they begin to write about it, and it becomes another facet of the kind of scholarly work that they do.
But would it not be unusual to have a director, a person who's a scholar in literature or in anthropology, to become a director of a program in Judaic Studies? Is that?
Not especially unusual, only for the simple reason that in most universities, it's very unusual for a university to actually have a department of Judaic Studies. Almost with very few exceptions, the way that Judaic Studies programs are set up is they draw upon the faculty in different departments who have a research and teaching interest in this interdisciplinary field. And so typically those faculty who populate those departments are trained in the traditional disciplines, whether it's anthropology or history or sociology or literature. So while I would say that there are certainly people who are more firmly rooted in the field of Judaic Studies in their graduate training than I was. They get degrees in Jewish history or Jewish civilization.
That would be normal. That would be more normative.
That happens. But I have to say that it's a bit of a risk to decide to get a graduate degree in that field, because there are so many fewer job opportunities in that, as opposed to, say, a job opportunity in an English department that might involve some features of Judaic Studies.
So the fact that the dean approached you was not unusual to you, and you could see it happening, and it seemed to be a seamless transition the way you're talking.
Yeah, although I will say that I had some concerns. I didn't want this to mean that I was leaving the scholarship that interested me behind, that I was no longer going to be identified as and recognized as a scholar in the field of 17th century English literature. That was important to me.
So let's fast forward. So we talked about a seamless transition.
Yeah.
So now you're the director of Judaic Studies at UConn, and you get approached to be a vice provost.
Yeah.
Seems to me to be a bigger jump.
Yeah.
Am I incorrect?
No, that was a big jump. I had been hired by the University of Connecticut to come and direct their Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, and to take on the relatively newly established Conover Chair in Judaic Studies. And I did that for 5 years and was very happy, and I felt like we had done some really good things with the very generous resources that we had available to us. We were growing the program, we had expanded it to having an undergraduate major. And I had, as part of the activities that I had undertaken in the center, tried to establish relationships with connections to other interdisciplinary institutes and centers at the university, of which there are quite a few. And I had good relationships.
What does that word mean, interdisciplinary, academically?
So most universities are organized around standing departments: English, history, sociology, anthropology, physics, chemistry, biology. But increasingly, it's become clear that those disciplinary boundaries constrain some of the more interesting and cutting-edge kind of research that gets done. And so someone who might be trained within an English department would still have a good deal to learn from and to contribute to scholarly conversations that incorporate aspects of the social sciences, philosophy.
Is that a new way of thinking, or that is?
I wouldn't call it especially new. I mean, I think this has been happening in academia for a number of years now, and it for a long time was happening in a more informal way. People just simply, on their own, undertook to train themselves in areas that were not, strictly speaking, part of the discipline that they had been trained in.
What does a provo do?
The Provost's office is the chief academic office of the university. It oversees all of the academic undertakings at the institution. And at a place as large as the University of Connecticut, that's a big job. It involves all of the schools and colleges, whether it's the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the School of Engineering, but also the professional schools like the law school and the dental school and the nursing school. There's a lot of personnel management. There's a lot of envisioning the direction that the institution wants to advance itself in, how to devote its limited resources in ways that are especially effective in building on its strengths and growing its capacities in different ways. The Provost's office is really where a lot of those decisions originate, though they are not ultimately implemented directly through the Provost's office. They're implemented through the deans of the schools and the colleges. To put it bluntly, we hold a lot of the purse strings. So a lot of the resources initially get allocated through the Provost's office into the various schools and colleges, and we make those decisions based on what we think ought to be some of the main priorities of the institution. So within the Provost's office, because it's such a big operation, there are a number of vice provosts, of which I am one, and each of us has a slightly different area of focus, though we all participate in a lot of the decisions and conversations collectively.
So do they give you like 4 departments that you're in charge of?
No. So my position is the Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Initiatives. And that covers a huge gamut of possible configurations and connections. I nominally have the responsibility of oversight for all of the various interdisciplinary centers and institutes that the university has. And that includes something like the Center for Judaic Studies, which is a relatively modest operation, but it also includes something like the Institute for Community Health, and that is a vast enterprise that covers many of the health sciences on campus. It includes the Institute for System Genomics, which is a very complex array of faculty who work in biology and cell biology and biochemistry and so on.
So the departments are completely disconnected from one another, ostensibly.
Well, they have their own way of operating, and they hire their own faculty, and they promote and evaluate them their own ways. But the faculty themselves, then, because of the research that they undertake, get involved in these various centers and institutes that often bring them in contact with faculty from other colleges or departments or schools.
So do you think, you've got this training, you're an expert in 17th century literature, then you're the department head of Judaic Studies, and now you're the vice provost. Is that good training for a vice provost, what you did before?
I don't think anything is especially good training for what I do now. Though, to be perfectly honest, I think I skipped a few grades.
That's what I'm hearing. That's what I'm hearing.
Ordinarily, well, not ordinarily, but it's not unusual for someone to move into the provost's office after he or she has been a dean. And I haven't had that opportunity to do that. So I haven't had the experience of managing very large and disparate departments and resources the way that some of my colleagues have.
So why did they pick you?
I think because I was interested in and have been very big advocate of interdisciplinary work from very early on in my career. And also because I represent a voice that the provost's office wanted to have present in our conversations, which is I represent the humanities, which sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. If you scale or if you judge the operations of the institution by budget allocation, by the size of the operating budgets, the humanities are a pretty small enterprise because they're relatively cheap to run. We don't have huge investments in lab space. We don't have vast arrays of research assistants. We don't have enormous equipment that needs to be purchased. Really, our primary investment in the humanities is in our personnel and our faculty.
So you talked about skipping a few grades to become the vice provost. What's the next grade after vice provost in a university?
Well, I think it would be it's conceivable that someone from this position could then go on to become a dean or become a provost somewhere else. I think it's not inevitable or obvious. I mean, some folks come into the provost's office, work as a vice provost for a number of years, and then they go back to their academic work, which is an entirely possible route for me to follow too. I think this is a year for me to figure out whether that's a path I want to go on or whether I want to pursue further administrative work or go back to my research. Because it really is very difficult to sustain any kind of significant research agenda in this position right now. There's just too much going on.
Right, I can't ask you what you want to do next because you haven't done this long enough
right.
for me to, it's unreasonable for me to ask the question and you can't give me an answer that makes sense.
Right.
So if you were advising a young person who is an academic, what would you, and they were an ambitious young person, they wanted to be president of a university, what would you tell them the path to that would be?
Well, I think the first and most important step, and really there's no replacement for this, is to establish your scholarly credentials. That has to happen before anything else happens.
So you think they all have to have a PhD?
Oh, well, I was going to say absolutely, but actually there is now some movement away from that as far as college presidents go. I mean, there are universities that are bringing in presidents who come from the world of business or who perhaps have a PhD but haven't really had a scholarly career. The position of university president has changed dramatically in the last 25 or 30 years.
So the first thing you mentioned was that you got to have a degree.
I would say, and
What's
I still
next?
believe in this, I think having scholarly credentials is important because it's important for you to have a deep familiarity with the way that the academic world works, and it's also, I think, equally important for the people whom you will be president for to have a sense that they can respect you for what you've achieved academically, that you are someone who speaks their language and understands their values.
Anything else? Any other quality that you find of
I think
interest?
that as the career continues, and again, it can't be overestimated just how important it is to establish those scholarly credentials first, to get the work done that needs to get done in order to advance, to get your promotion, to be promoted to associate professor and tenured, and then to be promoted to full professor. But as you advance in those academic ranks, you will be presented with opportunities for various kinds of leadership positions, whether it's chairing committees, to becoming a director of an undergraduate program or of a graduate program, becoming the chair or the head of a department. Those are all intervening steps along the way where you have the opportunity to decide whether you have a taste for it, whether you are any good at it, and whether it's something that you want to continue for and become even more ambitious in that direction. So it's a kind of incremental path, and I don't think perhaps to my detriment, I agreed to take on a lot of those responsibilities fairly early on in my career.
Did you have an idea that you wanted to, were you ambitious?
I don't think that I was particularly sure that I wanted to go into senior administration, but I was interested in the way universities operate. I did feel like I wanted to play a role in some of the policy decisions and the directions that the department took itself. I wanted to be in that conversation, and I felt the only way that I could be was if I had some skin in the game, if I was willing to devote some of my own time to participating in committee work, to chairing those committees, doing the kind of slog work that is involved in some of those committees, because it was important to me. I think that scholarship really only has a value if it's seen in the larger context of the university community. And one of the reasons I got into this world was because I so valued talking with other smart people and hearing what they were working on and thinking about ways in which what they were working on might inform what I was working on and whether there were interesting similarities to our work. That only happens when you get in the same room as these people. And I know plenty of scholars who are perfectly content to sit in their offices with their heads in their books, writing their articles in their books, and they produce enormous amounts of impressive scholarship, and I have enormous respect for them.
But
that's not something that was not appealing to me.
Right, that is not who you are.
Yeah.
We've been talking to Jeffrey Shoulson, and he couldn't repeat enough that it's really important to have scholarly credentials if indeed you want to work in a university environment. And he's clearly working at the top of one of the top universities in Connecticut. He's at UConn. The amount of people that are at UConn, there's 30,000 undergraduates. It's a big job. Thank you very much. I guess we call you Vice Provost. Is that the title?
You can call me Jeffrey, yes.
Vice Provost. We've been talking to Vice Provost Jeffrey Shoulson.